science of trauma and some of the strategies that they based their program in. And then finally, Mary Rolando from the Department of Children's Services at the state of Tennessee will talk about the work in Tennessee in becoming a trauma-informed state. So with that, I will turn it over to Andy, and like I said, we'll just pause and Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's a thrill to be here, and I'm just so impressed with Senator Heitkamp's leadership on this issue. Of course, I pushed the wrong button. There we go. So I'm going to give a quick overview today. I think it'll be helpful to have a little history of where this field has come from, where we are now, where we're going, and some of the practice that's emerging across the nation. Before I get started, I want to remind people what the science has taught us. Science has shown us conclusively that trauma is real. The impact of trauma is real. This is not something that's a subjective state that you can ignore and overcome by toughing up. As Dr. Gary Sletkin says, exposure to violence is processed by the brain, just like tuberculosis is processed by the lungs. It's a very real phenomenon. And given the level of violence in society today, that might seem kind of discouraging. But the truth is, this is a very hopeful message, extremely hopeful message. He goes on to say, our service systems have been constructed on an incorrect theory. Once we start asking the right questions, solutions emerge. And the truth is, there are hundreds of wonderful people out there working in our service systems, and they are making a bit of a difference, but in general, our service systems are failing us. The good news is, now that we're asking the right questions, that can change. So the history here. The modern concept of traumatic stress and psychological trauma really emerged back in the 1970s with veterans coming back from Vietnam with what would eventually be called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. About the same time, there were researchers looking into how Holocaust survivors after World War II were doing. The women's movement brought issues of domestic violence and sexual assault to our awareness, and there was a strong movement towards preventing child abuse. The interesting thing is, back then, we thought of those problems as completely separate and discrete. We didn't see that they had anything in common. It would be decades before we started to realize how interconnected those problems really are. So the diagnosis of PTSD was accepted by the APA in 1980, which really kicked off this field. Over that decade, a lot of people started doing clinical treatment and research. A number of professional societies were developed. And by the 90s, all those professionals had started to come up with evidence-based practices, both on the treatment side and on the prevention side. So we really were starting to have a toolkit of stuff we could do to help people. At the same time, about the same time, the ACE study, which you heard about last time. By the way, how many of you were here at the last briefing? Okay, good. So you know the science, because we're not going to do the science this time. But that's about the time the ACE study was establishing for the first time that there is a strong link between childhood adversity and what happens to you as an adult. That was really the first time we had started to think of that, believe it or not, that what happens to kids affects the health of adults. So in the 2000s, two important things happened. One, the neurobiological research showed how that link actually happens biologically. And second, people started to realize that having effective trauma treatment wasn't enough. Okay? So the concept of trauma-informed approaches emerged. It's really a pretty simple concept. Basically, it's great to recognize that a kid isn't a bad kid, but maybe has a lot of trauma in his background, and he's acting out, not because he's a bad kid, but because he can't control his emotions, right? It's even better to be able to refer the kid to treatment so that they can get treated for that trauma. And let me just step back and thank you. Such a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, it's very nice to meet you.
Just so pleased to be there.
Thanks so much for coming in. You know, we're a dwindling crowd because everybody's like, phew. You know, the place, you know, it's like evaporation of human beings when the session closes. But, you know, thank you so much, all of you, for still hanging with us, still being interested in this subject matter, and still taking a look at what we can do better to develop. Am I doing something wrong? No, I did. Okay, it's her fault. What we can do better to kind of address current issues from a different kind of lens. You know, I've spent a lot of my time in public life dealing with drugs and addiction, spent a lot of time dealing with education and education reform, a lot of time dealing with domestic and family violence. Meaning you can go through all of those issues that we could pinpoint as some of the most difficult and pervasive challenges that confront American families. And you can say, why is it that we continue to have high levels of family violence? Why is it that we continue to have such high levels of addiction and a growing addiction problem in this country? What's causing this? And I think for a lot of years, we just kind of think about, well, how do we train parents? How do we, you know, so we're always doing this back end stuff. And I think the one thing that we do know from long-term studies is that early childhood intervention is absolutely critical for better outcomes. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That the money that we invest in children early on pays back huge returns. But what should that investment look like? I mean, what do we need to do at that point that will change outcomes if, in fact, children are going to continue to live in families that are broken, in homes that have high levels of abuse and neglect, sometimes sexual assault, and certainly high levels of addiction? How do we solve that problem? And one thing that we do know is that this is generational. I mean, we used to talk about this when we did domestic violence as a circle, you know, the generational circles, you know, that's going to just come around, and break the chain. How do we break this cycle of abuse? And one of the things that I think over a long period of time, doing a lot of scientific study, a lot of work that you're going to hear about today, but also just from people who deal with children and with behavior issues, we start thinking about how does childhood trauma, how does toxic trauma actually affect brain development? How does it actually affect generation to generation when systematically, as I believe in Native populations, we've seen systematic genocide for the time that people have come to our shore? What's the long-term effects on a population, and what's the long-term effects on children? And the one thing we know from all of this study and all of the science that is out there, now that we've actually started looking at this, is number one, we have to pay attention to toxic stress. We have to pay attention to adverse childhood experiences if we want different outcomes. So what does that look like? And what does it mean when we say that, to become trauma-informed and trauma-based institutions? And how do we integrate that knowledge, the information that you'll hear today, how do we integrate that in public policy making? How do we hopefully change outcomes? And what's great is that we're not alone. What's great is that we're not inventing this. We've got so many good partners. I just had a great visit from Johns Hopkins, their Institute for Native American Health. We know that the Menominee have done tremendous work with Native populations on their reservation. We know that we've seen places where it works. We have the Community Violence Intervention Program in Grand Forks, where they're literally taking children who have been in abusive homes, not always the subject of abuse, but certainly have witnessed abuse, and they're doing trauma treatments. And those treatments are better preparing kids, better building resiliency in kids. And so the one thing we know about trauma, and these guys will probably, you know, as I say, I'm not a psychologist, I just play one in the United States Senate. the one thing we know is there is good stress. Stress can make us stronger. We can, in fact, through adversity, kind of build a resiliency and build a capability. But we also know that too much stress breaks people. And when I talk about toxic stress and I talk about post-traumatic stress, especially with Native kids, people go, you know, I just thought that's something that happens to soldiers. And I said Native American kids, about 30% of them suffer post-traumatic stress at rates that rival Iraqi war vets. And so we have absolutely have got to begin to address the root cause of adversity and why we see this persistent cycle repeating itself. And in many cases, in many populations, not only repeating itself, but actually resulting in a downward spiral, not just maintenance. I did talk to my niece who runs the largest domestic violence shelter, and she was telling me about a population that she serves. It's one family. I think she's already had maybe 30 members of that family who have, in fact, used the shelter at one point or another. Think about that. And in those 30 members, they have traced this trauma back to one grandfather who sexually assaulted every one of them. So this matters. You know, paying attention to, number one, eliminating the root cause of that trauma and creating a culture, but building greater resiliency, because population after population will repeat patterns. And your social norms become what your experiences were. And so we're absolutely committed to this project. We think that when we build out more and more support, we will see attitudes change about whether we can, in fact, solve problems. I'm going to close with just a thought, and that is that if you talk to most of my colleagues and you talk about this problem and you talk about prevention and solutions, they pretty much are discouraged. There's not a lot of hope that we can change outcomes. I mean, that people just say that's the way it always is. And I tell a story, it's a true story about when I was working I first got elected as Attorney General, one of my big issues was family violence, that we ought to treat it as criminal justice problem, not just a public health problem. And so I went around and I spent a lot of time with cops, because at the time, law enforcement was not interested in the changes that we needed to make in terms of criminalizing the behavior. Law enforcement just thought this was a family matter, not really anybody else's business. And so I was giving a talk in a rural community, and I was talking about the need to change attitudes. And at the end of it, this man came up to me, an old retired police officer, and he kind of put his finger in my face. At the time, I was in my 30s, and said, "Listen here, girlie, men will always beat their wives, and you can't stop them." I said, "Well, you might be right. You might be right. Hope you're not right. But I do know we shouldn't live in a world where we don't try." And so all of the effort that we make in trying, we have to be willing to open up to new ideas, because the stuff that we've been doing so far has not achieved the desired result. And so to me, this is a path forward for hope. This is a path forward as you look at trauma-based and trauma-informed programs and what they can produce in terms of better graduation results, lower rates of addiction, lower rates of suicide. We now have science and we have study that informs what we need to do. But we can't, but it can't sit on the shelf, and it can't sit in the minds of great leaders in this movement like you see in this panel. It's got to migrate into the everyday population. And I like to look at this as a public health crisis. You know, when I was Attorney General, I helped negotiate the tobacco settlement. So I like to believe that behind immunizations, the tobacco control measures that we took are some of the greatest success stories of the public health movement. I mean, you look at it, I mean, dramatic rates of smoking, less cardiovascular disease. We can show you numbers that go along with changes in how we promoted public health strategies in tobacco prevention. If you look at the public health outcomes, the healthcare outcomes of children with high rates of adverse childhood experiences, and you follow them 20 years, and you say, now we are in that place where we're treating chronic disease, whether it's hypertension, whether it is, in fact, diabetes, that are all exacerbated by childhood trauma. We're treating respiratory problems that are exacerbated by we're treating mental health problems that are exacerbated by childhood trauma. So rather than treat the effects and the chronic disease that comes as a result of it, we've got to start deploying methods to prevent toxic trauma from destroying people's lives. You know, the statistic that one pediatrician gave us is if you have adverse childhood experiences, 4 or more, that your life expectancy is 20 years less. In what world should that be acceptable? Some people say it's a little higher, depends on how you count it. But I can tell you that it should motivate all of us to look at not only how we're raising our children, but it should look at how we're treating our children. And what things can we do that will change outcomes long term. And so this is just the beginning of the dialogue. We're doing a series of 2 events where we do the scientific background on all of this, build out support. We're going to do a field hearing in North Dakota on trauma, Native Indian Affairs field hearing, and then really begin to build out from that core group of senators who are really engaged a broader understanding and really take our cues from the public health professionals and the people who have been in this battle a lot longer, showing not only can we change outcomes, but let's be hopeful that we can, in fact, change lives and change the direction of so many people and build a more resilient and a healthier population. So I'm pretty committed to this, talk about it all the time, and really look forward to you guys being engaged and, you know, if, to the extent that you represent members, taking this message back, continuing to help spread the word that we can, in fact, with good investments, change outcomes. So thank you so much.
So Senator Heitkamp just covered a lot of material I was going to cover, so I can just skip a lot of these slides. One of the important things she pointed out was that we need effective trauma treatment, but we also need a culture change in our organizations and our services in our communities to both prevent the problems from happening and to recognize the problems when we see them so that we can react differently to them. And that's really where we're going as a field. So the trajectory I was going to describe was just that. We're moving from focusing just on services to getting into the community so that everybody can be involved. And one of the things that happened that's allowing us to do this is we have a ton of evidence-based treatments and prevention strategies. There are hundreds of them. They're not well used, they ought to be, but they're there. The tools are in the toolkit at the individual level. But we need to work at the organizational and community levels to start moving into that prevention piece. So I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about what the heck is this trauma-informed approach that everybody's talking about. So we've got trauma treatment, we need trauma-informed approaches. According to SAMHSA, you're trauma-informed if you realize how widespread trauma is and what the consequences are, so you got a basic understanding. If you recognize it when you see it, so you see somebody walking down the street talking to themselves, you don't immediately think, what's wrong with that dude? You think, wonder what happened to him to bring him to that situation. You have some tools to respond. So when you're in that situation and you recognize trauma, you've got something you can do, whether it's in yourself or in somebody else. So you have some basic responses, and you resist re-traumatization. That means basically the brain doesn't distinguish between the original trauma and a situation now that reminds you of where you were. In fact, you put a trauma survivor in a situation that seems to them, reminds them of the place where they were originally traumatized, And it's just as painful and just as damaging as the original trauma. So knowing that, we have an obligation to make sure we're not putting trauma survivors in situations that recreate that original trauma. So one of the real things I want you to understand from this talk is this stuff is happening everywhere. One of the things that's cool about this trauma-informed approach is you don't have to be a therapist to do it. Anybody can do this. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic, as they say in the field. It can happen anywhere, and it focuses as much on the staff, the people delivering services, as it does focus on the people who are being served. So that means you can have a trauma-informed approach in a yoga class, in a courtroom, in a schoolroom, in a hospital, anywhere, in an office. And that's what we're seeing happening. I go around a lot and I ask people out there, why are you doing this? It means changing the way you do business. It's a lot of work. Why are you bothering? And I almost always get the same answer. It's some variation of, you know what? It works. It makes a difference to what I'm trying to do. As one woman said to me, with this approach, we can turn kids around that we were sure we were going to lose. Okay. So that's powerful. And so there's huge uptake across the country. I'm going to skip that slide because I want to give the people who are doing it in the field a chance to really talk to you about that. But there really is huge interest and uptake. A couple of examples, a social networking site, ACES Connection, has almost 10,000 members and growing fast. Federal Partners national event last year had 2,000 people each day at it. That's an interagency effort that involves 13 different federal agencies, an amazing effort. Robert Wood Johnson, among other foundations, are really pouring money into this. It's really happening. And this is my favorite slide. This is where I was going to list all of the states, counties, and cities that are taking leadership on this issue and becoming a trauma-informed community. I got up to 27 states, and I hadn't even started doing the cities and the counties, and I thought, hey, you better just leave this slide blank, because if you leave somebody out, you're going to offend somebody who's doing something important. But 27 states that I could find right off the bat are doing something. I left the slide in because the message is, chances are very good in your home state or in your home community, something is happening. So again, I want to give most of the time here to my colleagues who are going to talk about what's happening in their community. But a couple of other communities, just so you know, there aren't just two. Tarpon Springs, Florida, a small city on the west coast of Florida. Their initiative was started by a mayor who was about to term out and wanted to do something to solve all the problems of the city. When she heard about the ACE study, it was like the light bulb went off, and she said, oh my God, you mean I could just have one initiative that dealt with homelessness and police problems and school problems and substance abuse and domestic violence? I don't have to have 20 different projects? I said, that's it. And they have a completely citizen-led program up there. It's really very cool. The Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin, I'm not going to go into this. All of these have been written up so you can find information. But what I want you to look at on this is the measures of improvement across domains. What's really interesting about this work is that it doesn't focus on a single problem, but it works to strengthen communities, strengthen capacity, and it affects social indicators across a whole range of domains. So in the Menominees, teen births decreased, substance abuse, educational outcomes. They even had improved dental outcomes after a couple of years of doing this work. And the third community I want to mention is Washington State. I love this example because they've actually developed a new model for how to work in communities based on this kind of approach. They also have had amazing outcomes, which you can see in the right-hand column here. But what I want to focus on here, what they believe are the keys to success of their project, is they shifted the focus from adding new services to supporting parents as agents of change. So it isn't all about new services, but how do you increase community capacity? How do you empower communities to solve their own problems? They shifted from a culture of despair to one of hope and healing, and they put the scientific findings directly in the hands of citizens. So what you learned the last time, if you were here, probably gave you a good understanding. That information has to get in the hands of everyday citizens because they're the ones that are going to make the difference. We do know some characteristics of trauma-informed communities. I'm not going to go through them. Let me end by saying the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, which is the organization I'm representing, we came together basically because we recognized that the advocacy world is just as badly siloed as the service world, right? Everything goes in silos, or I guess around here they call them stovepipes, or everything goes in its topical area, and there's not enough cross-fertilization. So we're a group that represents everybody who's affected by trauma, cross-discipline, cross-domain, cross walks of life. And what we're hoping to do is move the policy discussion towards ways of thinking that will support the communities that are trying to do this cross-silo, trauma-informed work. So they need pooled funding to support cross-agency collaboration, for example. And we do have a piece of legislation that we're working on that you can pick up a preliminary draft there that would allow communities to pool multiple sources of funding that they currently have to do in silos into a single program so that they could address this issue in a systemic way. So he has those. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to two of the women who are leading these efforts at the community level.
Okay, thanks, Megan. Thank you all for being here. And I come from Kansas City, Missouri. But I was raised in St. Louis, so if you notice that I talk funny, it's from St. Louis, not Kansas City. I don't want them to have to be blamed for my accent. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the state of Missouri and then also in Kansas City and eastern Kansas. Anybody here from Kansas? Anybody here from Missouri? No? Oh, well, wait until you hear this. You're going to want to come to visit me. So these are the things we're going to cover. A little bit about why now, a little bit about community awareness, then creating trauma-informed communities, then a little bit about community support. In your slides, in the handout that you picked up, you have a lot of information about additional community initiatives that we are working on, and then a little bit about what else I see as being needed. And then you'll have some slides for resources from Missouri that you can refer to. So why now? Why is Missouri? Why is Kansas City? Why are 4 counties in Kansas interested in creating a trauma-informed community? It's because we see this overwhelming incidence of violence. We are faced every day with issues around racism. We know that our early childhood learning kids are ending up getting expelled from preschool. We have schools that have high rates of expulsion, low graduation rates. Healthcare talks about issues of noncompliance. We have issues in our justice system of high rates of incarceration in our African-American male population. And we know that we have 22 armed services people commit suicide every day. Pretty compelling reasons to move forward. So what are we doing? Well, we have created in Kansas City, based on some of the studies that we had, a group that's been working on creating trauma awareness. And that group started out as Trauma Matters KC, and thanks to Robert Woods Johnson and then the Health Federation of Philadelphia, we received a grant that's called Resilient KC. We're working with specifically 5 different target audiences: healthcare, businesses, justice, armed services, and education, to really bring trauma-informed practices into the field. This is a really unique partnership with the Chamber of Commerce. Our Kansas City Chamber of Commerce adopted a recommendation to say that all of the businesses who are members of the chamber should actually become trauma-informed practices. So we have some real unique partnerships there. One of the things that this has done is it's helped us bring more and more people in to understand about ACEs, and also then to move things forward in terms of creating trauma-sensitive schools, trauma-sensitive healthcare organizations. Big thing that I want to talk to you about today is our Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. Police have been in the news a lot, and it's not always been really favorable in terms of the press that they've been getting. Our Kansas City Police Department started some 15 years ago to put together what's called crisis intervention teams. That means that police officers go through 40 hours of special training. Within that 40 hours now of special training that they receive about people who have mental illness and about how to approach people with mental illness, they now have 2 hours of training on trauma-informed care and practices, and they also then spend an hour or more about self-care. Because what has happened to our police is that they're under great pressure. They're experiencing vicarious trauma. They're experiencing compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. So we started with the CIT teams getting all this training. There's more than 1,000 police officers trained in CIT in the Kansas City area. The other thing I want to talk to you about, so let me move west to east, and we'll talk about St. Louis just for a second. One of the things that the folks in St. Louis heard through their health commission was, we have this toxic stress. We have to do something about toxic stress. So they created this department within the Regional Health Commission called Alive and Well STL. Well, the very, very first thing that Alive and Well STL did was they partnered with one of the local TV stations and with the radio stations. And so the TV station created a documentary, and the documentary was aired against American Idol. And because they had so much interest in St. Louis, there were actually more people watching the documentary about trauma-informed care and practices than there were people watching American Idol. They're pretty proud of that, so I'm proud of it for them. Now I'm going to go back to, from trauma awareness, then you move to trauma-informed, our trauma-responsive communities, and now our police department is offering 4-hour training specifically about surviving secondary trauma. The stories that we hear from our police officers who have gone through this training are compelling. Let me give you a couple. We have a police officer who wrote, I went from a hostage situation to attempted suicide to a domestic violence call. In between, because of this training and because I had learned to breathe, to be mindful, and I had learned how to calm my system down, I was calm at every call. In the past, I would have been hyper aroused and I might have actually hurt somebody down the road because that tension, that stress is cumulative throughout my shift. We help our officers understand that when they are on 12-hour shifts, that their allostatic load is beyond capacity, they're hyper-aroused. It takes them 12 hours to calm down, and then what happens to them? They go right back to work. So helping them find ways to calm down faster and calm down in between all of the calls that they have has been critically important. We have police officers tell us they're better parents, they're better spouses as a result of this training that we're doing. Whoops, went to the wrong button. Wait, oh, that's okay. We'll just keep moving. Okay, so in terms of professional development, we have great sponsorship from our legislature and then from the Missouri Departments of Mental Health, Social Services, and Correction. We're doing 8-hour trainings in all of those systems. Another very, very quick story, we have a family whose baby died of sudden infant death, and the prosecutors and the police officers interviewed the family, and they couldn't talk about what was going on with them. And so then when they came into the courtroom, the prosecutors and the police officers wanted the family jailed because they said, since they can't talk about this, they must have killed their baby. The family services worker who had been through the trauma-informed training and who understood what was happening in the brain to these parents said, you know, it's not possible for them to talk about it. They're in grief. They can't think. They can't bring the words to you. What's remarkable is the judge agreed with the family services worker and released those parents so that the parents were able to keep their family intact, even though they had experienced such an awful, awful thing with a baby that they very dearly loved. So in terms of community support, we've had lots. You can read that on your handout. In terms of additional initiatives, we've had a lot of additional initiatives. Here's our awareness initiatives. One of the things that it's really important to know is that stories do matter. People remember the stories. KU, Megan said, I went to KU, so give you a quick KU story. KU's doing a lot of really, really good research. They've researched how to build resilience for foster children. They've also provided programs for early childhood development to help parents recognize their own trauma and then what's happening to them. Their program's called Lemonade for Life. So what is it that we need down the road? We need more collaboration from all the federal departments and agencies. Our police need block grant funding for first responder training. We need universal early childhood learning experiences that incorporate social and emotional skill development. We need financial support to demonstrate outcomes, because when we go and talk to people, the very first thing people want to know is, what's the return on investment? We also need higher education to incorporate trauma-informed practices into their curricula. You'll see on your slides contacts. I don't do this by myself. We have lots and lots of people involved, but these are some really key people. I'll highlight Tim Decker from the Children and Family Services Division, Rob Freund from Alive and Well St. Louis, and Darren Ivey, who's our captain of our police department, who's a major, major champion. Here's some Missouri and Kansas resources for you. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to share this information. And I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you. Well, I too am delighted to be here and participate in this briefing. It is really wonderful that there is such a tremendous amount of interest in addressing adverse childhood experiences. And so I am here representing the Tennessee effort, which we refer to as Building Strong Brains, Tennessee's ACEs initiative. The project is a product of our recognition that public investment in early childhood can produce and does produce long-term improvements in the cognitive and social development of children. This is really essential for building a workforce of the future, good citizens and the future generations. The goal of the project is pretty simple, and that's to make sure that Tennessee children have everything that they need to thrive. And I think what has happened is that we really have had a large number of people have these issues crystallized for them, that in fact the future prosperity of the state depends on building the strong brain architecture of the children of today, and that makes it imperative that we act. Tennessee is a state of about 6.6 million people, 20% of whom live at or below the poverty level. And the reason that I've included the TennCare information that's at the bottom of that chart is that of the $11.1 billion that we've got in the total HCFA budget, 10.8 billion of that is in TennCare. That's our Medicaid equivalent. And there are 1.4 million people covered by this program. And of that, 53% of all births are covered by TennCare. 50% of all children are covered by TennCare. But the real astounding thing is that of that 1.4 million people, 3% account for 50% of the budget. So if that doesn't smack of the long-term effects of ACEs resulting in very, very complicated and costly care, nothing will. And as we know, ACEs know no geographic, cultural, or boundaries or demographics of any sort. And so you'll see on the heat map that we have far too many counties with 2 or more ACEs that, to which we must address ourselves. And so there were a couple of things that brought us to this point where we said we've got to change the culture in Tennessee so that the state's overarching early childhood philosophy, policies, programs, and practices, what we refer to as the 4 Ps, utilize the latest brain science to help to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. I won't go through all of these goals. They're pretty straightforward. But of course, we want to increase the potential that every child born in Tennessee has the opportunity to lead a healthy life. We want to raise the public awareness and knowledge about ACEs, impact public policy, support innovations at the local level that will address ACEs and stress in children. And of course, we want to have sustainable funding to ensure that the state maintains the long-term commitment to reduce ACEs. And then we embrace an open, responsive governance through what is referred to as the 3 Branches Institute and statewide planning. There were a couple of things that happened almost coincidentally that raised the visibility of ACEs as an issue in Tennessee. Oops. Previous. One of them was a tremendous amount of activity that occurred in Memphis and Shelby County, where people were very, very concerned about the very poor health state of adults. And so under the leadership of particularly one long-term champion for and child advocacy, Barbara Nixon, the leadership of the city and county really came together and decided that they were going to take on the issue of ACEs. And in January of 2015, released a statistically sound study about ACEs in Memphis, Shelby County that was so compelling that the 2 mayors said that we simply could not lose another generation of children. And so they've really gotten behind what it is that it takes to help parents be good parents, to build community, specifically through universal parenting places, which are not a panacea by any means, and it's not the answer to everything, but they were underwritten by the Pyramid Peak Foundation, which had been a major contributor to educational issues in Memphis, Shelby County for a number of years. And through the vigorous advocacy of a man named Chris Peck, who is the former editor of the Commercial Appeal, the Memphis newspaper, he convinced the benefactor of the Pyramid Peak Foundation that if you waited until a child got to school to try and intervene, you were waiting much too long. And so the benefactor was so generous as to spin off the resources to begin addressing ACEs in a very cohesive way, and that became the ACEs Awareness Foundation. The other thing that raised the visibility was the Three Branches Institute, which was where the governor invited the leadership of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to come together and form a common agenda to advance child welfare and to realign juvenile justice. We brought in Robert Anda, one of the two principal co-investigators of the original research that's been cited already. Actually, Dr. Vince Folletti had provided technical assistance to the work that was going on in Memphis-Shelby County. And after we brought Rob Anda in for a major presentation, we continued to just prime the pump with all things ACEs. And so 1 year ago this month, the commissioner of the Department of Children's Services at that time, Jim Henry, encouraged the Institute to sponsor a summit about all things ACEs. And actually, that created a real watershed for this project, because with the imprimatur of the governor's office behind it, we had over 240 leaders to attend a day-long summit. They were from government, from communities. We had mayors, we had the leadership of philanthropy, academia, faith organization, and others. And Dan Press likes to point out that it was really quite something that we even had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court there participating the entire day, which was structured around the two sciences, brain science and communication science. It was also the public debut of the brain architecture game, and it concluded with a Tennessee panel and a call to action. So here's a picture of the brain architecture game when it is intact. But here is the game in action. And so using straws, pipe cleaners, to build a brain, periodically in the process, one is given a card that says either a very positive experience or a negative experience. And the message is that it's not just about your genes and it's not about your parents. Sometimes it's just about the card that you're dealt. And that was why one might say, you know, what happened to you? And then here was our panel, and the man at the podium is our rock star, that's Chris Peck. And as we were talking at lunch, every rock star needs a manager. So I get to be the project manager for this initiative. The woman in white is our in-house ACEs and brain expert. I think it would be okay to say that she has had ACE experience herself and has really developed skills that all of us emulate. And then the woman in red is our in-house communications expert. She's a devotee of the Frameworks Institute processes in language and messaging, and we have a real champion in her. And so what was really quite something was it ended up being front page news, and actually it was above the fold. And so when you have this kind of recognition for an intention to do something, you have to do it. And so we think that there are basically three key factors that helped us to get traction pretty quickly. One was that even though we had a tremendous amount of state support for this effort, there's consensus that dealing with ACEs has to be, ACEs prevention and mitigation has to be community-based and community-developed. We had a proposal from the Frameworks Institute, which is based here in DC, and is considered to be the leading communication science organization in the Western world to work with. And then Jim Henry, who had initiated the summit, had become the deputy governor, and even in advance of the summit, he asked that all of the child-serving departments identify a couple of leaders who could come together with us and help to move this project forward. And so the other strengths that we had was the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, which has been a very, very strong and well-versed child advocacy organization in the state. They have a regional infrastructure that permits us to use our work to continue to drive this out throughout the state. And then they are also the Annie E. Casey Kids Count partner, so we've got access to a lot of good information. The Department of Health has had a very good focus on ACEs for a period of time, and strong leadership in maternal and child health that is articulate and motivated. And then the Children's Cabinet is co-chaired by the governor and the First Lady. And so the First Lady, who is involved in the Memphis projects and has been a stalwart member of the Three Branches Institute, certainly has put all of her effort around it. And then we are really, truly an increasingly trauma-informed system, in that we have the benefit of 5 centers of excellence for children in or at risk of state custody. They are the academic and clinical expert partnership partners with the Department of Children's Services. Attributable to their learning collaboratives, at any given time, we have as many as 700 to 800 clinicians who are well-versed and are in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, PICT, and now ARC, which stands for attachment, self-regulation, and competency. So we're really making the most of what we have in community. So the structure is one in which we've got the public sector steering group that's already been described. The private sector steering group is comprised of foundations, business leaders, and others, faith-based community advocates, and it's supported by the foundations and in-kind resources of state government. We characterize our intentions with what we say is transforming the 4 Ps, again, philosophy, policies, program, and professional practice. We're doing this through a knowledge mobilization path that capitalizes on symposia about the biology, the science and biology of health, of programmatic innovations, and the science of policy. These are augmented with frame labs, which are a deep dive into the communication science of early childhood development. I know that you're already familiar with the values and the metaphors that have been established by with the Frameworks Institute, so we'll just recognize that much of the language that you've heard is a result of the work that they have done and that we are doing in much greater depth. And so when you know something, then what do? We need community action plans and innovation teams that would be that are being developed to really create new ways to solve old problems. And we did borrow it from the Alberta Family Wellness Program. I think one of you mentioned that initiative. I won't bore you with what we've already completed, but I will tell you that we were really quite surprised when, pleasantly surprised, when the governor put in his budget amendment $1.25 million in appropriations for ACE-related activities. No limitations, no parameters other than ACE-related activities. So as of last Friday, we released the announcement of funding. Proposals will be due on August 5, and we expect to get a wide variety of projects that will address not only how to build healthy, strong brains, but also how to deal with the community conditions that are ACEs. So we're completing a master deck of materials about brain science, communication science, and trauma that can be made available to be used statewide for targeted audiences and at various lengths of time. Innovation team on planning. We will evaluate the proposals and initiate them. And then we're implementing strategies to engage affinity groups that are hard to reach, like pediatricians, business leaders, and others. And then we're synchronizing with another major effort. So I won't go too much into this except to say that we expect to learn from the projects that we will fund. We will be asking all health-related contracts from the state to include ACE prevention and trauma-informed services. We developed a return on investment that makes it understandable for business leaders and others to realize that we really are thinking about the workforce of tomorrow, and we're researching the policies that need to be revised to support this. So we've got some things going for us. The Title IV waiver, of course, is a prevention process. The McVie funding for home visitation. Our Medicaid 10-care policies do permit maternal screening for depression and counseling for mothers in treatment. And we're looking at some of the strategies to improve the families and economic security, as you see there. We were so bold as to talk about, before my coming to represent the project, what might be done at the federal level, and you'll see that our suggestions are to really look at the areas to reduce income inequality, establish baseline support, provide parental leave, substance abuse that includes both parents and their children, and then extend Medicaid coverage in the area states where it doesn't for prevention services, and to address the social determinants of health. So it's very clear that this initiative has had the benefit of many assets, not the least of which is the support from the administration, that we've got very, very visible community leadership that drives home that these are community solutions. We're pretty organized, and the relationship with the Frameworks Institute is just invaluable. We've had great publicity, and we've got strong public relations. So there's a long way to go, there's no doubt about it. But we do think that with this effort that we will be able to change the culture such that the question will move from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So thank you very much.
Hey guys, we have time for questions. Anyone have any questions for our panel?
Yeah, once people are identified, again, every state is a little bit different, but community mental health centers and the National Council of Community Behavioral Health have been promoting the acquisition of skills for therapists to actually be able to treat these folks. It does require specialized treatment, and so once you're identified as needing that level of services, so referral to a community mental health center is probably one of the very first things. There are also private practitioners who have had specialized training in EMDR, in Mary mentioned TF's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, parent-child interactive therapy. The Veterans Administration also has trained a number of therapists in prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. You know, one of the really interesting things that some of our leaders in this field are also finding, though, is because the trauma lives in the cells, that things like yoga and kickboxing and having an occupational therapist on staff are also critically important. And so this part of the field is continuing to evolve and continuing to engage folks who have specialized interest in those areas too.
That's certainly a fine response, and again, to the extent that we have a pretty good number of people in the clinical arena who are very skilled. with these interventions has really given us a leg up. And we recognize in the child welfare system that the very fact that you're taking a child away from their family is traumatizing. So we continue to work with that all the time.
Could I just add something? Thought you might be going to, how do you actually deal with folks before they need professional help? And again, there are a myriad of what we call sensitive practices that are useful for folks. And so just let me give you a couple examples. In healthcare, having the doctor allow the patient to stop the procedure if the patient's starting to freak out. Having the doctor explain the procedure through the procedure is really important. In schools, we're working with teachers on deep breathing and mindfulness training so that as children begin to escalate, that the teachers actually have some of those skills to help children calm down. There's some really excellent tools in terms of emotional regulation that are helpful for kids and actually for adults too. So there's all kinds of tools out there. We don't have to really invent anything. We just have to use what we know.
Any other questions? Yeah.
That's a great question. We really struggled with the scope. And so we wrote the scope broad enough to be able to permit a range of projects and proposals to be successful or to be approved. But we also had the technical requirements that include addressing, using frameworks, principles to address the 4 areas, the 4 Ps that we've talked about, have to have a track record. We decided that with this being new resources that we were going to learn a lot, and so we certainly did not want to have somebody that thought they had a good idea and no record at all. So they were pretty stringent criteria. We'll know a good bit about what we're going to get because we did ask for letters of interest to be submitted within 1 week. And since we released this just last Friday, I'm looking forward to work tomorrow just to see, what we get. It's gone out to over 200 and some people and their listservs, and that announcement of funding has already come back to me 4 or 5 times.
The Menominee tribe in Wisconsin, which has gotten a lot of attention and recently got an RWJ Culture of Health Award, so you can find out a lot about them online. It's been written up a lot. They have done an extraordinary job of making their entire reservation trauma-informed, building on their traditional Native practices. Their project got started when they realized they were told by the state that their schools were all failing and they had the worst public health in the entire state. And as it happened, 2 brothers ran the healthcare system and the school system on the reservation. They started looking into it and realized that these problems were directly related and they were directly tied to the decades and decades of historical trauma that the tribe had experienced. And the tribe had really been decimated over a period of years, and that one of their fundamental goals in the project was to restore and continue to build on their pride as a people and their traditional cultural practices. So every step of the way, their healthcare interventions, their work with teens, their work with adolescent substance abusers, they did it in a way that incorporated and built on their native language, their native traditions, their native culture, their native practices. So if you look at the way they went about it, as well as the specific interventions that they've developed, It's an incredibly culturally informed, trauma-informed way of doing business. And they're now working with other tribes across the country. Dan is directly involved in this, and I'm sure can give you more information, because what's happened is not just the public health indicators are improving, their educational indicators are improving, but they also have a sort of renewed spirit of who they are as a people and pride in who they are and who they've been, and their resilience, because as well as being decimated, they demonstrated incredible resilience as a people to live through what they lived through. So I think you're going to see this more and more in areas where culture is very, very important to a group, because the two things are so related. Trauma, takes away your identity as a person, and that has to be restored culturally as well as other ways. Do people want to say anything about this? Dan, you want to? Was your question specific to Native Americans, or is it broader as well, to culturally responsive trauma and responsive? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I just want to, it occurs to me to also mention that the San Francisco Department of Public Health has done, in my way of thinking, the best job of anybody I've seen across the country in integrating cultural sensitivity with their trauma-informed approach. They have many immigrants, many different population groups, so it isn't one culture. But they've used the theoretical framework of cultural humility, if you're familiar with that work, and built the cultural humility framework and the trauma-informed framework together. And so everything that they do in the name of being trauma-informed is also integrating this notion of cultural humility, understanding your own implicit biases, looking at how these things affect you personally. It's really a very, very beautiful job. They've got a curriculum they've developed that they're willing to share. So contact the San Francisco Department of Public Health. Wonderful resources.
The other, real quick, the other thing I think you're going to find, and Andy kind of spoke to this, is really drawing on people's cultural heritage and using the strengths of that. That's going on in Alaska, too.
Well, we've run over our time, but I thank you much for joining us. This briefing will be available on Senator Heitkamp's YouTube page, on her YouTube channel, as well as the materials from the briefing. So
Please join me in thanking our great panelists again.
By being here, you've joined the movement. So now you have voice to share trauma-informed care and practices with everybody you meet. Senator Heitkamp doesn't need to be the only one walking the halls talking about trauma. Thank you for joining the movement. We've got your sign-up sheet.